So today we're going to be talking about sanctuary cities and exactly what that means in the New York context. But before we get into that conversation, we thought we'd bring you up to speed with some numbers on sanctuary cities and immigrants in the United States. But first slide coming up here. In a first of its kind study from the Center for American Progress, which happens to be a nonpartisan think tank, they really delved into the effects of sanctuary city policies on crime and the economy in counties across the country. And their findings are pretty succinct. 35.5% fewer crimes were committed per 10,000 people in sanctuary counties compared to non-sanctuary counties. When we look at median household income, there was an average of about $4,300 more coming into families who live in those same sanctuary counties. As for the poverty rate, there's a 2.3% lower correlation for those counties than for non-sanctuary counties. And looking at unemployment, 1.1% lower rates of unemployment in those counties. So for all of those fears about people stealing jobs and driving up crime, those numbers simply don't bear out. I'm going to show you another view here, looking at sanctuary cities. Donald Trump has made a lot of noise and bluster about cutting funding for sanctuary cities. We can know that in the United States, they kick in to the top 10 cities about $84 billion a year. Help me out on the number with that. New York City got about $701.6 million in federal funding in the last go-round from the feds. And that is the money that seems to be at risk if Donald Trump does, in fact, have the ability to pull the plug on federal funding. You can see in Chicago, they got about $526 million, all the way down to D.C., which got $20.4 million from the federal government to help do that job. You can see that the $701 million is the amount that came in from the feds, but Mayor de Blasio just released a budget of about $84.6 billion in operating expenditures for the city of New York for his proposed budget. So that just contextualizes the amount of money that's at risk versus what the city's actually operating on. We'll get into that a little bit more in the A block.
On one side, you have the newly inaugurated President of the United States. On the other, the mayor of the nation's largest city. The conflict is at once ideological, like do sanctuary cities actually encourage immigrants to bypass existing laws, and practical, like what will the city do if the feds cut off the funds?
Well, these are just two of the questions both elected officials and everyday citizens have to contend with as America makes its way towards a comprehensive policy on immigration. But right now, we want to welcome back both Nisha Agarwal, the Commissioner for the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. Great to see you again.
Good to see you.
And back on the show again is our friend Jeff Mays. He's a politics reporter for DNAinfo, and he's been following this story. Hey, Jeff, welcome back. All right, Mr. Watkins.
All right, let's start this conversation because, you know, sanctuary cities is trending all across America right now. Just that term, sanctuary cities, how does New York City define sanctuary cities?
Yeah, sure. So what's interesting about the term is that it's trending, but it doesn't actually have a real definition. And so I think in New York, how we think about this issue is that we want to be a welcoming and inclusive city for all, including immigrants, and that includes undocumented immigrants. And we sort of believe that, you know, we have values of keeping New York City safe and secure and inclusive, and that those values are not in tension with one another. They actually can go together.
So these are values. It's not something that's codified by laws where even if President Trump said, I disagree with New York's stance because of this sanction, this law, so it's not something that he can drag you into court over.
Right. We've had some people ask us, can you send us your sanctuary city law? And we don't actually have such a law.
Yeah.
I think in some cases, the way people think about this issue is really for cities that have laws or rules around how they interact with federal immigration enforcement. And in that context, New York City does have a law of where we'll sort of hand people over or won't hand people over to immigration authorities. But really, the word doesn't have much definition. This is one aspect of it.
So, Jeff, we have sanctuary city designation in New York. What about the state? How does that play out all the way up to the governor's office?
Well, the state, it depends on the municipality and whether they cooperate with federal immigration authorities. Also to note, in New York City, undocumented immigrants, you have access to certain social services regardless of your immigration status. So that's one of the other things that defines a sanctuary city. But across the state, it depends on each different municipality. But Governor Cuomo has taken the same stance that Mayor de Blasio has taken in that, those policies will not be threatened by the federal government.
It's a rare show of unity between the mayor and the governor.
So, Commissioner, you issued a statement yesterday, the Chancellor's letter on immigration, and it really breaks down and talks to a lot of people's fears of what they have. Can you just sort of walk us through this letter, please?
Sure. So I think the purpose of the letter, as you said, there's many families in New York City and around the country that are very nervous and fearful about what's happening at the federal level. So this was a letter to say, one, that regardless of immigration status of yourself or your kids are entitled to an education in New York, that we are not going to be in the business of allowing ICE, unless they have legal authority to be coming in. This is a safe space, and that kids should be accessing school and educational services.
So seeing as it's not codified by law, how will President Trump's executive orders on these 7 nations work to expand or change the way that New York City thinks about its status as a sanctuary city?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things to that. One, New York City doesn't intend to change the way it interacts with immigrant communities. Healthcare services, educational services, you name it, will be open to all the way they have been. I think the thing that's challenging about these executive orders is they're very unclear and they're actually pretty vague. So they say, we're going to pull your federal funding, but they don't say what funding that's going to be or how they're going to do it. So I think we have to kind of wait and see what tools they'll actually use, and then if we need to, we're ready to go to court to challenge them.
Well, in what ways can New York City sort of negatively be impacted with the loss of these funds?
I think the best example I can give you is something that the Congress tried to do a couple of years ago. So they tried to advance legislation that would pull community development block grant funding and law enforcement funding. And that bill didn't go anywhere. It was stopped. Actually, mayors spoke out against it. But think about that. Those were grants for small business trainings, community revitalization. It, in some ways, has nothing to do with immigration. In some ways, it really just has to do with all of us. And I think that's the really scary part of all this.
So I want to give Jeff Mays some credit for a second, because while a lot of people were blowing up the president and making all these ridiculous statements, you were doing the work of saying, this is how this cannot happen, and detailing precedent and laws as to why Trump can't just say $704 million, yank, I'm taking that from New York.
Right. Well, I mean, if you read the executive order, it threatens to remove all federal funding. First of all, that's the threat in the executive order. So last year, New York City received about $8.8 billion, actually, in different various federal funds to various agencies. But the city actually believes that under this order, there could be only about $150 or $160 million that's at threat, and that's because there are several rules around federal funding. So first off, the Constitution, the 10th Amendment really guarantees that the federal government can't necessarily force non-federal entities to do its bidding. So, for example, a couple decades ago, there was the Brady Bill where there was a gun enforcement. They wanted local law enforcement authorities to, do background checks, et cetera. Supreme Court said you can't force them to do that. There's also another taxing and spending clause in the Constitution, which does designate that the federal government can withhold federal funds for certain reasons for noncompliance, but there are guidelines. So, for example, it has to be germane to the issue, as you said. So they just can't remove housing funds or highway funds. It has to be germane to the immigration issue. It also the funds also have to be not coercive. So meaning they can't threaten to remove all of your federal funds, for example. Right. And that case came up recently with the expansion of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. The Supreme Court actually, in the current Chief Justice, ruled that the federal government couldn't threaten to remove all Medicaid funding from states if they didn't expand Medicaid. So it also has to be reasonable. And then there also has to be language in the federal legislation that allows the federal government to say, hey, you have to do immigration enforcement in order to receive these fundings. So there are several reasons why the city believes that only a small portion of funding is at risk. And regardless of that, the mayor has said that even then, he will not comply with these policies.
Yeah.
Well, we are, as we know here in New York City, a city of immigrants. Who is actually covered under this sanctuary city sort of policy when the mayor speaks? Because I know this past weekend, in regards to the ban in the airports, there was, like you said, everything in the executive order is pretty vague. So how do you sort of delineate between students with visas, fiancé visas, green card? I mean, how do you sort of unpack that?
Yeah, it's a good question because it just shows how complicated all of these executive orders are making our lives right now. So I think from New York's perspective, immigrants, even if you're undocumented immigrants, have access to health care, have access to educational services. That full range really applies to everyone in New York. And so I think that if that's what is meant by sanctuary city, we don't plan to change in those ways. There's other respects in which we really think about the importance of immigrant communities interacting with law enforcement. If you're a victim of a crime, you witness a crime, we want immigrant families to feel safe, reporting that to the police without worrying that they're going to be on a deportation pipeline. And I think that's what the sanctuary cities issue is really getting at.
Well, furthermore, to follow up with that, how is New York City protecting undocumented residents who have applied for the ID NYC card?
Sure. So now, if you're applying for the ID NYC, we have a policy in place where we're not keeping copies of the sort of underlying identity and residency documents that you submit. The sort of documents that we have had from the past, we're litigating in court and fighting hard to sort of protect New Yorkers' privacy. In that instance, they're asking for almost 1 million people's personal information. The city does not have any desire to hand that over.
Including my info, and no thank you.
We're
Please
working
don't
for
share
you.
with anyone. But I wanted to get into the fact that it's an election year in New York City. And to the earlier point of Aaron's intro is that there are some people who are of the mind that sanctuary cities encourage people to enter the U.S. illegally because there's a safe harbor if you can just make it there. Is it politically expedient in the New York scene for anyone to pick up that mantle and say, we're going to lose funds? I don't want to be a mayor who's getting into a contest with the president over money for good tax-paying Americans.
Well, I mean, I think New York's status as a sanctuary city shows how we feel about immigrants. I believe we have about 500,000 undocumented residents here, undocumented immigrants.
Who don't vote.
Contrary
Contrary to what Donald Trump said.
They can't vote.
They don't vote.
Vote.
So,
and 40% of the city's population, I believe, is foreign-born as well. So this is truly a city of immigrants. If you listen to the rhetoric coming from Mayor Bill de Blasio, he certainly hasn't been spouting any of that rhetoric. He has been pro-immigrant. We're going to protect you. They're fighting, as the commissioner said, they are fighting to destroy that ID NYC data, which they originally said they would do after 2 years. And also the governor has also stepped up. He said, this weekend, I am Muslim. Right. And so that's not going to fly in New York City. Yeah. Now, if you get outside of New York City, there may be a little difference. But in New York City, you're not going to see that kind of talk towards immigrants.
Okay. How do we how do you take back the narrative? I mean, Brian, when you talked at the beginning of the segment, you said crime is lower, median household income is up, poverty is lower, unemployment rate is lower in sanctuary cities. How do you make people sort of acknowledge that simple fact? That seems like an ideal direction for the city and the country to be moving in.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I think the mayor couldn't agree with you more, right? The study, the facts are that we've had inclusive policies with respect to immigrants, and we've seen really low crime rates. And that this idea that sanctuary cities are actually harbors for criminals and people are running amok and committing crimes is just factually not true. And the reason for that is we're building community police relationships rather than breaking them down, which is what some of these other federal policies are trying to do.
So in our last minute, NYCID was pioneering, largest program in the country, and you talked about people saying, send us New York's law. I wonder what kind of communication, if there's a sort of network of resistance emerging with other municipalities reaching out to New York for some guidance on this.
Yeah, absolutely. We work actually as part of a coalition called Cities for Action and share information. So even this past weekend when airports around the country were facing challenges with individuals who were banned, essentially not being allowed in and being detained, we were in communication, sort of trading ideas, and that includes also on policies. And very important for cities to be standing together right now.
Best practices.
Stand together.
Thank you so much,
Thank you,
Commissioner.
Thank you.
Jeff Mays will keep reading you in DNA.
Thank you.